Today I welcome Mark Earngey, my brother and colleague here at Moore College. Mark Earngey is a lecturer in doctrine and church history here at Moore College. And we're going to be talking today about a lecture that Mark is going to be giving, a public lecture that he's going to be giving in a few days' time on Tuesday the 14th of April 2020 at 7 p.m. and it's all going to be available online because it's basically an online lecture. No one's going to be in the room. But I want to talk to him about that because the lecture is going to be on the responses to the plague amongst those people from the Reformation. So people from 500 years ago or so. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks very much, Lionel. Good to be here, there or somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, be wherever we are.
Yep.
Mark, I want to start by just asking you a little bit about your study and what you've done in the past and where you went. So you're an Anglican minister in the diocese.
I am.
Yep. And
came through Moore College, got ordained, did some ministry in Toongabbie.
Yeah, Toongabbie, that's right. Yep. Now you did that, and then you decided to sort of go elsewhere and study some history and theology and stuff. What was that all about? Why did you do that?
It's a good question. So I left, my wife Tanya and I, and we had two little kids at that stage. We went over from Toongabbie, we left and went over to Oxford in England, and we spent 4 wonderful years over there doing a master's and a PhD in, a DPhil, which is what they call it at Oxford, but whatever, in church history, ecclesiastical history, particularly looking at the English Reformation. So it's pretty special time and a pretty special place to do that kind of study.
My question would be, like, why did you sort of, decide to leave good old Toongabbie and the ministry of the gospel that you had there and go and sort of study history? Did you suddenly become some kind of, academic who wasn't interested in ministry anymore?
Yeah, that's really
leading
interesting.
Question.
Yeah. No, I suppose I had a real heart for people, which is why I wanted to do the further study in order to help train ministers. In fact, I remember being encouraged to go and do a bit of study actually overseas, and my response was, I'm not sure about that. I've got a bit of a heart for pastoral ministry. And this person said to me, oh, no, that's exactly the right answer. I'm sorry to say that's the right answer. So this person said, no, actually we need more people at Moore College who have pastoral hearts, who are going to teach theology to future ministers to do pastoral ministry. And I thought, actually, that really resonates with me. I mean, I found when I was at college, the best lecturers were the ones that were sharp as a tack, but really had a heart for people. And I thought, I can do that. That'd be great, actually. I sort of see myself as a minister who happens to work in a college now rather than a parish, which is great. But why go away to Oxford to do that? It's a really interesting question. I mean, I suppose I've got a real interest in history. When I was at school, I wasn't a particularly much of a history buff or anything like that. And in fact, I didn't do many arts subjects, and I went to university to computer science, and I really only learned how to speak the English language. Some would argue that I ever did learn that. But I only really learned about the English language when I came to Moore College and did Greek, learned what a preposition was. So anyway, I was a bit behind the 8 ball, but I had a real interest in history, and I seemed to be pretty decent at it. So I went over to England, and I wanted to look at the English Reformation. Well, I mean, why do in the first place is an interesting question. And for me, history, like I think all of us, helps explain who we are. It's a question of identity. Who am I? Where have I come from? Why do people around me think like they think and do what they do and say what they say? And how am I to make sense of different ways of doing things and traditions and ways of reading the Bible and church practices and theological thoughts? And actually a lot of unraveling those questions comes from historical understanding. And so we're really interested, and particularly when it came to the English Reformation and the Reformation more generally, I thought, wow, there's a lot to be gleaned here to explain kind of why we think the way we think, and should we think the way we think, and were they right, and all those big, lots of fun.
So it helps us to understand ourselves. Maybe, to ask the question in another way, it's kind of the same question, but it's the sort of the negative. What happens, do you reckon, if we don't, if we forget our history?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, it's really interesting. Sometimes, I mean, throughout history, the ones that go off the rails, Christians that go off the rails, are the ones that think that all they need is their Bible, and they don't need anyone else who's come before them, and you know, that they're smarter than everyone else, and all their new novel interpretations of things are the right ones, and they're usually the ones that go off the rails. So you know, there's nothing new under the sun, and there's lots of mistakes that have been made before, and so history is also one of those good little guardrail systems. They help us keep us on course and keep us going in the right direction. So that's one of the good uses of history as well.
So if you don't know even what the rails are, then you're in much more danger of going off them because you haven't realised that you weren't even on them in the first place. Or
pretty much. You know, and that's why I think it's really helpful when I see students learning about the big debates and bust ups of the past and where things have gone off the rails. Kind of light bulb moments, and that's why we don't do that, or that's why I shouldn't, you know, start thinking of these things. And I should take the creeds more seriously because gee, these guys have hammered out some theology, and gee, I'd be crazy to kind of disagree with that. Those thoughts, yeah.
I think this is a little bit of a digression in some ways, but just in my own field of New Testament studies, it's really interesting that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and even before then, there's been a whole lot of movements in Pauline study, the study of the Apostle Paul and his letters, where people have discovered all these kind of new things, but they're really not new at all because they go back to particularly the reformers. And just in the last few years, there's been a resurgence in biblical studies, particularly New Testament Pauline studies, going, the reformers actually thought about some of these things in Paul's letters, to do with justification. And rather than the reformers being a kind of either a two-dimensional figures who you have to conform to, or two-dimensional figures who are the villains who made it all go wrong, people are saying that there was actually a huge amount of sophistication and thought that went into doctrines of justification and questions of salvation and church and all sorts of from the reformers. So yeah, I think there's someone mowing the lawn close by you, so I'm getting some funny sounds coming through. But,
is that right? I don't know what it is. I mean, it could be the laptop itself. Who knows?
Right. Yeah, who knows? Anyway, some strange sounds coming through. This is what happens with these chats.
How's that now? Yeah. Is that a little bit better?
Yeah, a little bit. I think so. Yeah, we'll see how we go. So that I just to affirm that.
No, totally. I mean, it is interesting. You do see that in a lot of doctrine and systematic theology as well, where scant attention is actually made to the historical traditions. You can see people and traditions being written off in a sentence, or described as flat earthers, or some kind of put down comment, and will dispatch with that whole tradition or that particular thinker. But actually, normally when you see that sort of thing, it should probably alert you to say that person doesn't know what they're talking about, because the tradition is usually far richer than you can write off in a sentence. And when you see this in other ways too, the Calvin versus the Calvinists thesis. Calvin was the high watermark of all Reformed theology, and everyone who came after him ruined it. It went downhill with arid, dry, scholastic, metaphysical, come up with whatever put-down term you want to come up with, kind of insert here category. And all those kind of moves that sometimes you see people make normally rely on dodgy history. And so history right enables you to engage with these things. I think actually history makes you probably a better theologian. Big theological mistakes are often made because of bad history. And actually the reverse is true as well. To do good history, church history, I think actually requires being a decent theologian, because you see a lot of dodgy history done by church historians that don't have good theology. So again, it's one of those things that I think it's really important for a whole theological education to get all of these ingredients really well. Good biblical studies, good biblical theology, good doctrine, good church history, good philosophy, good ethics. To see these things as a package rather than to kind of become a specialist and really not, be strong on other important disciplines.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's a very broad thing. I'm glad we've had a chance to talk about these very broad questions, and I do agree with you. That's what's great about being together as a faculty. We're all sort of working together, aren't we, rather than being specialised in.
I do love that. One of the things I've enjoyed since coming to Moore College has been able to be all on the same floor. A question, just wander over. I might ask you a quick question about, as I've done, about New Testament, and you might ask me something about Cranmer and the Reformers. Yeah. So it's quite great. Yeah, collaborate. Yep.
That's why I'm trying to keep it up by having these chats. Now we'll talk about more specifically the question of the plagues and the Reformers' response to the plagues, or the response amongst Reformation churches to the plagues. I'm not sure how broadly you're going, but that's obviously, that we were talking about various theological issues. That's also a very practical issue, and it has to do with all sorts of issues to do with church and how we respond and all those things. What are your thoughts? Why are you looking at this particular question about the Reformers' response to the plagues, and how do you think it's going to help us?
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, mate. So next Tuesday night, I'm going to give a public lecture on Protestants and Plague, and particularly
Protestants. Okay.
Yeah, the time of the Reformation. Just a good alliteration. Time of the Reformation, where a lot of our greats that we look up to had to respond to the problem of plague. And I'm really keen to explore the diversity of responses and the sort of different episodes and events and disasters and near misses that sort of befell the period, and then look at sort of why did they think the way they thought, and why did they respond in the way they responded? What were some of their sort of theological ways of interpreting what was going on? And then what sort of pastoral advice did they give in the context of outbursts of plague? That's the sort of thing I'm really interested in. I think it's a really fascinating thing. I mean, we at the moment with COVID-19, we speak about what we're experiencing as unprecedented. That's really interesting. In a sense, it is unprecedented because, it's a different kind of virus, and what we think, and it's affecting us. It's spread so rapidly because of modern navigation and trade and whatever the rest is, and our responses to it are quite different by virtue of technology. So in a lot of ways, it's an unprecedented episode, and in some ways, it's not. We forget. I mean, it's just really interesting for me. I think. Lyle and I, you and I, are pretty well off Western Australians who live in Sydney. We've got it pretty darn good, and our sort of generation, probably a couple of generations removed from war, which is in the history of the human race a really bizarre thing. We're really weird. We're the odd ones out when it comes to human beings. I think because we just don't have any great close contact with war like other people before us, and hardship and indeed plague. So we do feel these things as unprecedented in a particular way. But if you go back to the time of the Reformation, plague was really normal. If you live in the 16th century, basically anywhere in Europe, plague was pretty normal. And not only normal for your own lifetime, but your consciousness of plague was pretty normal. Because, only in the 14th century, a couple of centuries before, you had the Black Plague, which was enormous, which killed proportionally the same, so many people throughout Europe, that proportionally would be the same as all the deaths in all of the world wars in the 20th century put together.
Wow.
And all the way in England, half of the population in England at the time died of the Black Plague. Human mortality rates were so were high, but people died at such young ages. If you got to 40, you'd done pretty good. And other little interesting things, the Black Plague, which started in China, then it went to Italy, and then spread from there throughout Europe. A little parallel with today's COVID-19. But that major Black Plague, the bubonic plague that ravaged Europe, it's very interesting. I mean, it transformed society. Not initially, people carried on like normal and sort of did their day-to-day stuff and self-isolated and did all the rest. But it carried on, but it transformed society in terms of people and power and politics and all that sort of stuff. Now, that's all leading up to the Reformation period, where people are totally aware of the plague, and they're experiencing outbreaks and outbursts of the plague in their own time in the 16th century. Not only that, but lots of other diseases, sweating sickness and various pestilences are kicking around, and there's a huge impact on people's lives. So what does that kind of look like in the Reformation period? Well, pick your favourite reformer. They've had some near miss with plague. Luther, for instance, plague came to Wittenberg, and there's wonderful stories about how he stuck around and helped people and his wife. Zwingli, who, when plague came down to Zurich, he actually went back. He was out of town at the time, came back. He got the plague. He got sick, with the plague himself, and almost died. And in response to that, he wrote a plague hymn, actually about this pestilence and the Lord's provision through it. And in fact, a lot of theologians say that it was only after contracting the plague and surviving it did a lot of his mature theology take shape about his understanding of God's sovereignty. Cranmer over in England, when plague came to Cambridge, Cranmer left Cambridge, and he went and he had a particular meeting with Stephen Gardiner and Edmund Fox, and it was there during that flight from plague in safety at Waltham Abbey that Cranmer suggested to Stephen Gardiner and Fox that actually maybe with Henry VIII's problem is looking for an annulment, that he ought to consult the universities throughout Europe. And that suggestion got escalated to Henry. Thought it was a great idea, went and did it. And that basically got Cranmer in the good books with Henry, and shortly thereafter was promoted to Archbishop. So again, if plague hadn't happened in that instance, and if Cranmer didn't flee, then things would have been totally different historically.
Can I ask you? That's fascinating. Yeah. So plague is actually, as you're saying, it's so much a part of life that it's actually woven into the whole fabric of history. And so there's a sense in which you can't separate the plague from the Reformation. The plague is part of the context leading to things that are happening in the Reformation.
If it wasn't for plague, things would be totally different. Or if people got struck down and died of the plague, world history would be totally different.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of, one of the things we talk about with COVID-19 is there's this unprecedented, reality, partly because it's sort of unprecedented in terms of our modern health system. And that is, we have a modern health system that rightly seeks to care for everybody as much as humanly possible. And so one of the reasons that we're all isolating is to avoid the great disaster, which would be our health system being overwhelmed. That's where we don't want to be. And so we're actually changing our whole economy and everything that we do to avoid the great disaster of our health system not being overwhelmed. And I think rightly. Do you have a sense of, how overwhelming were the plagues in the times of the Reformation? Did they overwhelm their society, their health systems, as it were?
Great question. Health systems were really different back then. Let's take Calvin's Geneva, for instance. Plague struck there a number of times during the course of Calvin's ministry. and they established a plague hospital at that time to care for people struck down by the plague. And Calvin organised various pastors to be in charge of visiting those struck down by the plague. In other times, you can think of, general advice was self-isolation strategies were there. Aberdeen's an interesting example. They've got a sort of mountains in between. You could sort of protect the city in lots of ways, and they did that up in Scotland, and they self-isolated and they locked down the city. They wouldn't let people enter. They saw people coming far off from Edinburgh. They'd say, go back, we don't want you here. Same with Glasgow. And so Aberdeen had really interesting protection systems to self-isolate and lock down. London, very interestingly, there was a huge outburst of plague in 1563. Lots of stuff business as usual. That's when the 39 Articles get first drafted, right? So lots of business as usual, but still huge plague outbreak. And lots of stuff goes on. It's so bad they have to lock down the city. There were bonfires in the streets on 3 evenings. They thought they could consume the dirty, polluted, infected air, but it only precipitated intensification of the plague. Infected households were to display a blue cross on white paper with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," at the front of their houses. Lots of people were encouraged to stay indoors in London during this great plague. If you were one person, if they went outdoors to run errands, had to hold, if they were infected, hold a white stick to demonstrate that they were infected and stay away. So there are lots of different kind of strategies for coping that are very similar to today's strategy. It's really interesting, in 500 years, the same strategies: self-isolate, lock down, close your borders, don't let anyone in, stay in your homes. But they didn't have the healthcare systems. Some comments there. Yeah, there were plague hospitals set up in some places. There were doctors, but only really the wealthy could make use of them. There were lots of medicinal publications that would come up with different advices for different medical problems. But this actually opens up a really interesting thing, and that is that the world of early modern medicine was totally different. Their understanding of sickness and plague, in some ways, was similar. So they knew about infections through the air, but in some ways, and also they knew about contagion by touch and so forth. But in some ways, it's quite different too, because they believed that there were bodily humours. This was sort of there were lots of different ways of thinking about biology back in those days, but there were problems with temperature. They noticed you could have a temperature, but they thought you had humours, bodily humours, that needed to be sorted out, and they were connected to different seasons and months of the year, and those in turn were of course connected to the star systems. So you would buy these little almanacs, and the almanacs would tell you throughout the year when certain planets were in certain alignments, zodiac signs. Then there were different bits of advice, medicinal advice. So you should let blood, for instance, let out some blood, let out bad humours, and let out blood during certain months and seasons, and that would do certain things. And if you ate certain things during other months, that would do other things. So
let me say that sounds like it is different to modern medicine, but it also sounds quite similar to the massive amount of advice that's going around on social media about all the different remedies and theories that random people have about how to cope with COVID-19. So there's a similarity there too, isn't there?
Yeah. But that's just their worldview. Their outlook was different. There was real, that issue between stars, bodily humours, and so forth, and medicine kind of relates to their outlook of astrology. Astrology and astronomy were the same discipline back then. So if you walked into a church, it wouldn't be uncommon to see the star signs over the doorway on the way in. Because actually they knew that heavenly bodies were connected to, celestial bodies connected to earthly bodies. You know, there were stars in certain positions related to tides, and in their thoughts, stars in certain positions related to what you could do with your body. They just saw an interconnectedness in the universe in ways that we don't. Which leads me to another point, and that is to say that, and this is sort of absent from a lot of discussion, particularly in the Christian world at the moment with COVID-19. I'll do a lot of talking here, feel free to interrupt, but all the reformers without exception believed that plagues were God's visitation or judgment upon nations or groups of people for various different reasons. And so the response to plague was not just medical responses, but it was to get on your knees and pray for repentance, and that the Lord might relent, and simply that the Lord might just relent anyway, just take this plague. So there's a real spiritual dimension to their response to plague.
That's well, it's biblical in many ways, isn't it? Because I mean, I was just speaking to David Honey last week, and we were talking about Revelation and the kind of the horsemen of the apocalypse, and
pestilence.
that idea that, you know, we're not just talking about kind of the final end times. It's not the horsemen of the apocalypse will appear sometime in the future when Donald Trump does something, pressing the nuclear button or something. It's actually a description of God's not final, but his judgment upon us in so many different ways and down through the ages. And so the response is to realize our sin, and whether we actually, say, well, this particular disease has come because of this particular sin. That's not necessarily what we should be doing, but to say, well, this is a sign of God's judgment upon us, and it's not that I'm more sinful than you, or you're more sinful than me, or the people who get the disease are more sinful than people who don't. It's though the response to fall on our knees and pray and repent, come back to God and beg Him for mercy. I guess, is that what the reformers did? Is that the kind of thing? Or were they more specific?
Well, there's a range, right? I mean, generally, that's exactly right. That there was a general sense in which this is part of God's judgment, His response to sin, and they would catch that in terms of all sorts of different words: fatherly chastisement, wrath, punishment, visitation. These kinds of categories. In that general sense, the reformers weren't, and for any Anglicans listening, this is part of the prayer book theology. It's in the prayers and the rubrics of the service of visitation of the sick, which by the way is being quoted very frequently at the moment for the Lord's Supper discussions. That you can have the Lord's Supper without actually consuming the elements. What actually, just as a segue, but it needs to be said. People who are often quoting that are very quick to quote that little bit, but they often don't quote the rest, which is basically saying, if you're a minister, you go and visit that sick person, and if that sick person can take the elements of bread and wine, then you give them the elements of bread and wine. It's only when they absolutely cannot, take it, that you are to withhold the bread and wine and just have a spiritual communion. So I mean, it's not that the principle's untrue. The principle's true that you can do the spiritual communion thing, but the way it's being cast is, it's a sort of let's jump to an option. Whereas in the prayer book, it's an absolute worst case. But anyway.
This is a discussion that we were talking before. We'd like to keep having another discussion, which is related, but a discussion about church and how it's all happening. And so we'll be talking about that, I hope, in the future. Yeah.
But in terms of responses to plague, the reformers weren't averse to saying it's because of this national apostasy, for instance, that has brought on God's curse. They weren't averse to saying that. So Marian exiles, because of the reign of Queen Mary and her persecution and burning of Protestants, there is plague breaking out. Or you know, all that sort of thing. One interesting one that you see sometimes is Paul, the Apostle Paul makes reference to you know, getting sick. You know, I can't remember the word, but not pursuing the Lord's Supper correctly.
Oh yeah, in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah. And that's a curious turn of phrase. But a lot of the reformers actually took that as actually because of the idolatry of the Mass and that wrong approach to the Lord's Supper. The plague, sickness, is a direct result of that, which is very interesting. So I mean, it's all very interesting. I think to see the diversity of responses. But I think, I mean, some of the big takeouts for me are there's nothing new under the sun. Their responses pastorally were diverse. Sometimes they would encourage, but particularly ministers, they would say ministers must stay. You've got a pastoral responsibility to stay. Others, civil magistrates, have a ministerial responsibility to stay. But others, you know, if it's the right thing to do, go. There was a proverb in Germany, and I think the proverb went something like fly quickly, fly far away, and return late. Like don't come back there for a while. So lots of responses, but generally they had they wanted to respond to God in the middle of it, and I think that for me is a really interesting thing. Not just seeing this as a medical problem, but seeing this as an opportunity to respond to God.
Mm-hmm. And so different pastoral responses, but theological responses happening all the way through. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure, you know, I don't want to sort of steal all the thunder from the lecture that you're going to be giving on Tuesday, but I'm thinking, so the different dimensions are just sort of the context, you know, the context then is in many ways similar to our context today, even though it's different. There's the question of the theological response in terms of repentance and the identification of God's judgment, the dimension of what you actually do practically, and I guess they thought theologically and pastorally about those questions. You know, it's your pastoral responsibility to stay, or you know, or not. Are there other dimensions or other kind of areas of response?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the big ones. I think other ones are, yeah, I think the other sort of interesting things are just death is more in your face back then than it is now. And I think an interesting outtake is death is in our face now in ways that we haven't been used to for a little while. I'm speaking as a well-educated, well-off, white Australian. Yeah, who knows how long this thing will last and what will happen with COVID-19. But certainly I think it's presented hardship and death and difficulty in ways that are really new to us. But for a lot of the early moderns, it was really normal. And so I think just seeing how they responded, how they prayed, how they cared, how they approached death and spoke about death quite clearly, is really helpful, I think. It just sort of recalibrates us a little bit with the rest of the normal for the human race. Yeah, it's
making us, it's sort of normalizing us a bit. I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to guess that when the reformers were speaking about death, one of the key things that they did was they spoke about eternal life in the Lord Jesus Christ, that the salvation that we have and the justification that we have. I'm just guessing, you know, from someone who's read a bit of the reformers. Is that true? You know, that they pointed us to
entirely true. Yeah, it's entirely true. I mean, what's a good example? I'll just try and find a little prayer. In fact, why don't I just read you a line from Zwingli's Plague hymn?
Yeah.
He says, here's just a couple, I'll read it from the top. Help me, O Lord, my strength and my rock. Low at the door, I hear death knock. This is an anglicized version, of course. Uplift, shine arm, once pierced for me, that conquered death and set me free. Yet if thy voice in life's midday recalls my soul, then I obey. In faith and hope, earth I resign, secure of heaven, for I am thine. My pains increase, haste to console, for fear and woe seize body and soul. Death is at hand, my senses fail, my tongue is dumb, now Christ prevail. Lo, Satan strains to snatch his prey, I feel his grasp, must I give way? He harms me not, I fear no loss, for here I lie beneath thy cross. My God, my Lord, healed by the hand, upon the earth once more I stand. Let sin no more rule over me, my mouth shall sing alone to thee. Though now delayed my hour will come, involved perchance in deeper gloom, but let it come with joy I'll rise, and bear my yoke straight to the skies.
Thanks very much, Mark. I don't think we can end on anything more apt or helpful or Christ exalting than that hymn from Zwingli. So thank you. I really appreciate your time. And just to remind everyone that the lecture, the public lecture you're going to be giving, which is all online, is going to be at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the 14th of April. And you'll be able to find it by going to the Moore College website, moore.edu.au, and there should be a prominent link there for you to look at it, and it's free. It's a public lecture that you're giving. Is that right?
That's right.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks
No worries,
for your time.
Cheers, mate.